Um, in my native Key West, we had some pretty famous people living there. Jacques Cousteau was one, and Tennessee Williams was another. And I, I had problems, serious problems with dyslexia. And my grandmother and grandfather worked with me from the time that I was 3 or 4, realizing that there was something wrong. Um, my grandmother worked with me on reading, and my grandfather worked with me on writing. And one of the things that I was able to do was write poetry. Starting at about the age of 5, I think the first poem I did was about Halloween. And then another one was about my grandfather with the long ears and the long nose. Um, but I wrote this piece about a derelict fisherman. Um, and my grandmother helped me with, writing it in such a way that other people could read it. And it was about a derelict fisherman who lived off of what he caught and would sell the extra. And he was a pretty hardcore alcoholic. Um, but his name was Vanny Lee, and you know, I had a certain sensitivity as a child, recognizing people's limitations, some that I would end up having in my own life. And, it reaches a point where you have to get honest with yourself. But I guess as a child, in a way, I saw in Vanny Lee an honorable man that was challenged by his appetites, for lack of a better term. So the poem got published in the Mullet Wrapper, which is about all the newspaper in Key West is good for. I mean, you have fishermen lying about what they caught the day before with no pictures and volleyball scores and, somebody's lost cat. So I walked up to my house one day, and my next door neighbor, Zeppi Boucher, who could not stand Tennessee Williams. She didn't like the element that he brought with him because a lot of his friends were New Yorkers and she hated them. It wasn't because he was gay or because a lot of his friends were. It was because he was, bringing down this New York element, as she put it. But she said to me, "You got the kind of company in your house right now I don't like." And so I walked in, and there was this man there with a straw hat on. And he is talking to my father, and he's like, "Oh, Master Chief Petty Officer Lundberg, I just read little Mr. Fishbait's poem in the Mullet Wrapper, and I am entertaining some friends this weekend. Do you think that he could come to my house and recite poetry for me?" So my father looked at me and he said, "Do you want to do this?" And I said, "Yeah." And my mother is like, "Okay, we'll dress him up nice." And Tennessee Williams, who couldn't stand my mother, turned around and he said, "No, ma'am." He said, "At my party, we need some island color." And he looked at her and said, "The right kind of color." And here I am in my French sailor shirt that was just stained with bait and my cutoffs, and, I'm barefoot. So anyway, I went to his house and they put me up, my bare feet on the top of this mahogany table. And I proceeded to write recite my poetry. And one of his friends at the table, and now in retrospect, I mean, most of them were gay men, said, "Oh, isn't he a cute little bit of island trash?" And I stopped my recitation. I turned around and I said, "I'll have you know, my great uncle was the co-inventor of the Fram oil filter. He could buy and sell your ass." Well, Tennessee Williams loved this. It was the first time as a child I got to sit at the big table. And, he came out afterwards with an envelope and it had $100 in it. And so I went back to the house and my father looked at me and he said, "So," he said, "how did it go?" And I told him and I handed him the envelope. And he looked and he said, "We'll put this in the bank. It'll collect interest." And I said, "What's interest?" And my father at this point was getting emotional. It was one of the few times growing up that I saw him get this way. And anyway, he just looked at me and said, "Don't ask so many questions." So um, you know, he came in that night and he kissed me goodnight, which is something he rarely did, and he had tears in his eyes. Um, but coming full circle, about 5 or 6 years ago, Dr. John and I became friends. And we were sitting out on his porch in New Orleans, and we were waiting for Hurricane Ida. It was after Katrina, and we're out there, and as Mac puts it, jaw jacking all night. And I told him the story about Tennessee Williams, and he said, "Youst," he said, "this is amazing." And people know Dr. John was like one of my idols when I was growing up as a kid. And this one night with him on his porch, just sharing stories, it was so beautiful. So he said to me, "Well, he said, when I was out there, meaning when he was doing drugs, um, I used to go and buy my dope from this guy Pineapple in a bar. And he was one of the bartenders. And he went in one day, to get his drugs. And Pineapple told him that Tennessee Williams was in the back room and wanted to see him. And Mac is like, the Tennessee Williams? And so he went back and talked to him. And Tennessee had some friends of his that were coming to this bar. And he wanted some musicians for that night. And he asked Mac if he could get them. And Tennessee was very generous with all of them. And Mac was telling me, he's like, you know, he said, I don't know why I did it, but I stayed there at the piano after everybody left, and I did 3 more songs for him. And he gave me $300, and that was his tip. For me, it comes full circle. A lot of people were really surprised at Mac and I becoming friends. And I'm like, I turned around and I said, we are both children of the Gulf who have never forgotten who we are. And that is the absolute truth, of the matter. Um, there is no question about it. I have been truly blessed in this life. I've known a lot of artists and musicians and actors and people that I have tremendous respect for. A lot of them I don't write about or talk about because they try to remain under the radar in their personal lives. But the one thing, regardless of, whether it's the, guy who takes your trash on the street to somebody who, is on stage and a celebrated actor, when you speak to people in a language of common understanding and you can relate to them, the magic really happens. And you start to learn just in this life how similar paths are, even though lives are very different. I mean, recent events, 5 days in the intensive care unit and all of that have caused me to really reflect on my life. And I see a new beginning for myself. I mean, I'm a notorious storyteller, and that's the tradition that I come out of, shamanically and as a southerner and as a writer. We forget the importance of that. But, the best stories of all are the ones that are true and that have magic in them. Because it keeps people in that state of wonder and enchantment to where they accept the energy of magic and the power that it has to heal us all. And so that's a lot of what's based with my whole concept with the Gossamer Chord of healing through art and a lot of the things I do. And I think now as I'm getting into a different aspect of my life, I'm getting back to the basics of being a writer, of being a storyteller, of being a high priest. I need to focus more on that part of myself. And granted, I have room for a few artists in my life. I mean, Shay is certainly one of them, Evan, Maria, and other people in my life that I see what they're producing is so beautiful and so unique that it needs to be seen by others. It's kind of what I do. I go out there and I find these very gifted people. Sometimes they don't even realize they have something special, and I help them to see it. In my own case, as people are constantly reminding me, I have some magic to offer. And in my 40s, throughout them, I had a very wonderful time doing a lot of the things that I was doing and creating out there. But aside from the work that I do with artists, this time is about me. I mean, I'm going back to school. I need the academic world for a while, and I found in my sabbatical in August that I really needed to distance myself further um, from a lot of things in my life, and this coming year is going to be a very different one, very different. So, thanks for listening.